Just a couple of quick definitions before we start talking about some specifics. When we're talking about legends, or we might call them tall tales, there's a little bit difference between legends and tall tales, but sometimes we'll use the terms interchangeably in here. One definition of legend is that legends are set in the historic past, involve human protagonists, and call for an element of belief or disbelief. That's pretty vague, could encompass lots of different kinds of stories. But when we get into tall tales, one of the ways that we will differentiate between what we call tall tales and folk tales is that for the most part, tall tales will be aimed toward outsiders. That's what people from the Ozarks would tell to tourists or to someone who's not a native, whereas a folk tale is something that they would tell to each other. And as you can see there in the second definition, we've got folk tales are set in the historic past. They may involve human or non-human characters. And I don't know if we'll read any tonight that are non-human, but there are those animal tales. They're fictional, and they're told primarily for entertainment, although they may be used to point out a moral or illustrate a truth. And we'll find examples of some of these. Now, one of the things about a lot of the folk tales that we'll talk about tonight is that they were often told and are still often told as the truth, despite what that kind of general definition would suggest. Even though they are told for entertainment, in the Ozarks, as often as not, and probably more often than not, folk tales were told as the truth, even if they weren't. The tellers of folk tales often believed they were true, and we'll talk about the different reasons why that may be, why these tales that we can look at now and say, sounds a lot like other tales we've heard, maybe with the names and the places changed. Why would they think this is true? But we can talk about some of those reasons in a minute. And as I mentioned earlier, legends or tall tales are meant to be told in kind of a winking fashion. And if you can picture back in the 1950s, tourists coming to Branson and going on a float trip or stopping by a store or something like that where the men are out on the front porch whittling and telling stories. A tall tale would be the kind of story that a local would tell to tourists to pull their leg a little bit, maybe to try to pull one over on the tourist, while the other locals sitting around are winking at each other, thinking, this is a big windy. He's spinning a yarn here just for the sake of tricking a tourist or two, that kind of thing. Sometimes the tall tales are so unbelievable that even tourists aren't going to believe them. Sometimes there's just enough of a possibility that they're true, that they're believable, that they might actually snooker a tourist or an outsider into believing them. But as we'll see, a lot of the examples we'll have are such tall tales, such legends that common sense would tell you that they're not true, and they're told for entertainment purposes as well. And one of the things that's true about a lot of these folk tales we'll talk about, if not all of them, is that the folk tales that were common in the Ozarks up until a generation or two ago often had origins going all the way back to Europe. And here we find similarity between our earlier discussion of folk songs, folk music. A lot of the old ballads were the ones, and the fiddle tunes were the ones brought across the Atlantic by the ancestors of people who lived in the Ozarks, and the same is true for folk tales. A lot of these are variations of folk tales, some of which you will be familiar with, that were brought over from Europe, being the Ozarks usually from the British Isles somewhere. And people who've studied folk tales in the Ozarks and in Appalachia and places like that can often find direct connections and often there are different types and motifs of folk tales, and most of these folk tales that we'll talk about fit into one of those. But it is important to remember that they weren't inventions of the Ozarks. People didn't get over here all of a sudden start coming up with big stories and tales. They brought them with them, just like they did their music. And in some cases, the themes are very similar to the folk music. Remember, we talked about the old ballads, the child ballads that had their origins back in the British Isles, and a lot of them were very dark ballads and with death and just all kinds of kind of dark themes that we don't often dwell on today in music. The same will go for a lot of the folk tales. A lot of them are funny, but a lot of them are very dark.